Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives of the people on my network. So these are great leads to get to those books that have impacted their life, their work, their business, whatever it may be. All those worlds intersect. And I want to get to those books that have contributed the most to who they are and the value that they create. So in this series, I cover three categories of books. The first category, where the person is covering a book with me, sharing a book with me that I haven't read. The second category, where we're covering a book that we've both read, whether specifically for the series or we read it in our past lives before the series. The third category is when I have the author and or publisher on to give a face and a tone to the book to kind of get that message out there to the masses. And my guest today is Dr. Janet Polach. And Janet is a global authority in executive coaching, team development, and leadership. With her unique ability to elevate leaders from the minutiae to drive unparalleled organizational success, she serves as a trusted strategist and advisor to senior executives worldwide. Janet has expertly coached an array of executive and frontline leaders across the U.S., Europe, and Asia. Her experience in guiding diverse cross-geography teams to uncover their core purpose and align for success is unparalleled. Janet is celebrated for her insightful questioning, keen ability to synthesize information, and her respect for the power of silence and reflection. Her rich experience is further complemented by her distinguished service as a retired U.S. Marine Corps officer. I was lucky enough to meet Janet when she had heard about the series and reached out about coming out to share about her book. When that happens, I check out the person, we get to talking back and forth. We get a sense for each other's values, each other's works, see if it kind of complements the work that we're doing and what we want to put out there. And obviously it works because here I have her. So Janet, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, John. This is great. I appreciate it.
First off, first question I always ask, who are you today, Janet? So what's the work that you're doing today in the day-to-day and what does that look like?
Yeah. So as you said in the introduction, I do executive coaching and leadership development. I'll tell you about where that love and passion came about in a minute. But I work with, individuals, smaller companies, and of course, some of the biggest companies in the world. But where my sweet spot is working with individuals to help leaders, get unstuck, get from where they're at today, like you just said, in the minutiae, stuck in the details, to elevate themselves above and to really become the leaders that they hope that they would be. And I do that through team development, so working with the senior team and the CEO and their direct reports, or one-on-one with individuals.
And when it comes to that work, how long have you been doing that work, Janet?
Oh, I guess over 20 years. I got my start in the United States Marine Corps. I graduated from college with a degree in education in the middle of the school year. And as a 21-year-old, I didn't realize there was a recession going on. So jobs were a little bit few and far to come by. And had I gotten a job, I probably would have gotten laid off the next year. So I said, what are my options now? Graduate school was an option. I always loved school, but then I'd be really unemployable. Or I just kind of looked at the services. When I joined the Marine Corps, peace was literally breaking out all over the world. And it seemed like a good time. Women were getting to change their roles in the military. So I looked at all the services and the Marine Corps just won out.
So when it comes to, I'm always curious what led somebody to where they are now. Typically, I ask about when they leave college or enter the workforce, depending on their circumstances. You gave a little bit about your being in college. What did you go to school for, and what was it that influenced you to pursue that in school?
Yeah, I went to school for elementary education. I come from a long family of educators. My mother was a very, very talented educator. My sister is one. I think my brother-in-law is one. And so it just seemed to make sense. I love watching other people learn. I've got a master's in education as well. And so thought that I would just be in the classroom for many, many years. And when the economy said otherwise, I said, what do I do now? I really wanted to get something for my degree because I worked hard. I was a really good student. And the military, going in as an officer was just a really good option. I looked at all the services and voila, the Marine Corps recruiters just hit all the right buttons about esprit and belonging and being one of the few and the proud. And that's where I learned about leadership. That's when, the US military is really good about talking about leadership and teaching it and developing it. And that is the underpinnings of the work that I do today, which is leadership can be developed. Here's what good looks like. And yet every leader needs to shape their own sense of what good looks like to make sure that it fits for them.
So after the Marine, what do you think is the best thing you took away from the Marine Corps? Specialized to what you experienced. I don't want to
Yeah,
hear a slogan from the Marine Corps.
yeah,
I
yeah,
want to
yeah,
know.
yeah. Yeah. Well, what I took away was that leaders can be developed. I look back at who was in my year group in the officer program, and we had somebody who had a master's in reading. We had somebody, we had lawyers, of course. We had political scientists. We had data scientists. We had IT people. We had finance people. We had a lot of liberal arts folks that we took all that together and blended it together and set the standards about what does great leadership look like. And many of them, continued in a full career. I spent 3 or 4 years on active duty and then went into the reserves and served my country that way, and then got off active duty and then went to work for a government contractor in DC. And so I was able to leverage some of that knowledge and understanding about weapon systems and how things are structured, and did HR and human resource development then for a government contractor for several years.
So then what led you to strike out on your own, or what
Yeah.
led to that next phase?
The next phase then, my husband and I were living in Washington, D.C. He is also a Marine, got off active duty, decided to go back to school, and went to the University of Minnesota. And so that's where we settled then in our post-Marine career. We raised our family in Minneapolis. And then I was lucky enough to go back to school and earn my Ph.D. at the University of Minnesota.
And then your company today,
Yeah.
how did that come about? How did you found that? What was the impetus to get you into your
Yeah.
founding of the company?
So I was working for a couple of different consulting companies, doing some change management work, doing a little bit of leadership development. And I just, when you work for the really big consulting firms, you travel all the time. And I started to raise my family, and I thought, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I did launch out on my own. I had a couple of periods of being employed in between there, but about 20 years, my business has been on its own, and it's been a good journey, through tough times and not so tough times. The recession of 2008 was a little bit of a tough time for all of us, but this work, as you know, John, keeps going. That there's always another generation of leaders that can benefit from coaching, from interacting, from pausing and reflecting on how they see themselves and the world sees them. And so
Yeah.
it's been really good, interesting work.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that knowledge, that knowing that the work is always called for, that there's
Mhm.
always going to be a need for leaders. And aside from that continuation that you're always going to need leaders, is that idea, or just the reality that each generation of leader, your coaching isn't always going to look the same from one
Mhm.
generation to the next.
Yeah,
Not just because you've evolved, but because the circumstances have evolved.
yeah,
Technology has evolved. The political games around the world have evolved. Everything kind of trickles down to the person and the culture that they're surrounded by. So it's incredible how, yeah, there's always that need for leadership coaching, but how it just doesn't look different from, say, coaching somebody 20 years ago, 10
yeah.
years ago to today. It's just fascinating how much everything just kind of evolves exponentially, really.
Yeah, it really does. And you've made that a great backdrop. When I worked on my dissertation, my question was, what's the experience of college graduates during their first year of employment? And I explored that issue, and I was surprised with one of the themes that I uncovered, which is really about friendship making, rather than the work itself. So I explored that further, and I went back in the literature because what do young people expect in the workforce was really compelling to me. And I went back all the way to when the boomers and the greatest generation actually was entering the workforce. And I found that employers were saying the same kind of things about these young veterans who had seen the world during World War II. There was a great quote from Time magazine. They wanted to advance in 3 years to vice president, and they didn't want anybody to tell them how to do it. And, we say that about our Zers that are out there as well today. So what I discovered is leadership in your 20s and your work in your 20s looks kind of different than it does when you get to your 50s and you have your families and maybe a 2-career situation going on and children with the challenges that they have today of growing up. And so I think leadership development and executive coaching is different based on where the person is in their career. I find that that's more insightful than actually when they were specifically born.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean it differs from person to person. There's just so many different factors, circumstances, backgrounds, experiences that go into what formulates and makes and informs the leader that's sitting in front of you at any given time. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Janet, does it make sense? I can guess based on what you've told me about, well, your family, but does it make sense from your childhood that this is what you're doing now? How do you reconcile that?
In my childhood, women didn't get to do a lot. We were nurses, teachers, or I guess admin assistants. And I was really fortunate during my early years in my career, which was in the military, to see that evolution change. When I joined the Marine Corps, women were in support roles, supply, communications, intelligence, HR. And of course, now they get to do everything. They fly jet aircraft. They are company commanders in the infantry. And I got a chance to see that change and evolve. And so I think that really informed my perspective that women can do well in every single occupation, that whether you're a male leader or a female leader, you really can be effective. If you have to get the right capabilities and you have to demonstrate the right style. And that, when you follow your dreams and are true to yourself, I think you can get where you really had aspired to be.
But even you as a kid, what kind of kid were you? I'm talking about before
Oh,
military,
sure. Okay.
before high school. Because it's come up in this series where, and I'm sure maybe you've seen it in your coaching. I know I've seen it in mine where people lose themselves in their role. They get lost in the metrics, they get lost in the performance, the specs of what they're supposed to deliver, that they lose their wonder, they lose their imagination, their dreaming. Those are lofty goals, but it's part of us. So I'm always curious about what somebody brings from their childhood to what they're doing today, if there's a connection or not. So I'm talking even before high school as a kid, does it make sense that this is what you're doing? And I appreciate the other response you
Yeah.
gave because I'm fascinated by obviously all the studies of gender and military and all that. You're hearing about your experience and your takeaways, but I'm curious about when you were a kid to now, how do you connect the two?
Yeah. Boy, what a great question. And I don't think we often reflect on that, John. I'm not sure. I think people who knew me as a kid thought, well, Janet's going to be a teacher. I was a creative kid. I liked to tinker with arts and crafts. I enjoyed, as a kid, a girl did. I like to play house. I like to, set up, I guess, a little teaching center, and I was teaching my Barbie dolls. I wasn't much of a kind of play with guns and that kind of thing. What's carried into my adulthood, though, is the love of making. You can maybe see by the way I'm dressed, the painting behind me, which is not mine, but crafting. I'm a master quilter. probably 25 quilts to my name. I've taken up painting recently. And so, you know, coaching is about, it's kind of the nuts and bolts of organizations and driving profit and making sure things are success. And then the other half of my life is really about creating and something of beauty. My husband and I are very involved in the arts. We love concerts. We like going to the orchestra and hearing choirs sing. And so that whole dimension is really important to me. And I don't leave that at the door when I go into the office. It's part of who I am every single day. I may use analogies of an orchestra rather than a football team, for example. You know, because after all, if you're creating beauty, I think that's the highest order rather than necessarily winning. And so I think those are the things that have come from my childhood into my adult work.
Yeah, I love the way you tied it into the creativity you can provide, even through analogy to the work that you're doing with your clients, with the organizations, with your team. So thank you for that. Um, Janet, what would you consider your superpower?
Mm. I think my superpower is being able to listen and then ask reflective questions. It's really the essence of good coaching. Coaches, I think there's a misnomer, and John, I'm sure you run into this as well, that coaches don't tell people what to do. They don't listen to a situation and say, well, if I were you, here's what I do. What they do is ask questions that probe, just like you're doing, probe into deeper understanding, to deeper reflection. We avoid the question why, because that causes us to be defensive sometimes. But exploring questions that start with what, for example, what were you thinking as a child that you might be doing as an adult, for example, and then lining up what the difference is in terms of aspirations and reality. And so I think my superpower is that ability to ask great questions and then really just stop and listen to what the other person is saying.
Where do you get that respect for? I mean, obviously, you're a coach. Where do you get that respect for or power of listening?
Mm,
Um, yeah, where does that come from in you?
yeah, yeah. I bet it came from my dad. My dad sadly passed away when I was only about 20 years old, but he was a great listener. He was a great community builder in our small town. We used to say he knew everybody. And he'd been gone for about 10 years. And I was on a trip with some other people from my hometown. And this individual said to me, boy, Jan, you remind me a lot of your dad. And I think that was probably the best compliment I ever got
Mm.
in my entire life, because he was such a lovable and caring person.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that. It's kind of the same thing with me in terms of thinking of where the coach in me comes from, and it is from my father. Just
Mhm.
how he always wanted to help people, he always wanted to support people, he always wanted to enjoy life. So it was kind of like always working to find, okay, what is it we can enjoy today?
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's incredible what we get from our parents, and sometimes we don't realize it till later.
Yeah.
You don't really pick it up in the moment. You don't really see it in the moment, but when you think back and reflect, or somebody points it out to you, it's amazing that there's that connection. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And then finally, before we get into your book, Janet, what does leadership mean to you? You've covered aspects of it, but if you could
Yeah.
define it or break it down and share it with somebody, the meaning of it, what stands
Yeah.
out to you?
Well, I think fundamentally leadership is about working through other people. Sadly, at least in America, we promote people to managers because they were really good individual contributors. And if
Mm,
you drew a Venn diagram, you'd see that the overlap between individual contributor and manager is a fairly narrow slice. And
yeah.
so it's fundamentally understanding that to get stuff done, you're going to have to work through other people. And so that means developing them. It means understanding what motivates and drives them, where their passion is. It involves lining up the work so that people get to exercise their passion every single day of their work life. And then it's giving them feedback and recognition to help them know that they're on track. recognizing what their aspirations are and helping them achieve those.
Awesome. Thank you, Janet. Now let's jump into your book. If you could, why don't you introduce the book and tell us how the book came to be, if you could?
Yeah. So this was my second book. It's called The Strategic Leader's Mindset. My first book came out during COVID. It was, you and I talked about this, John. We all kind of found interesting things to do during the COVID time. Somebody had said, a couple people had said to me, Janet, you need to have a book. And so that was the time to do it. The first book was The 7 Mistakes New Managers Make. Because again, we promote people because they were great individual contributors. And so many of our managers really, really struggled during their first couple of years of being a manager. And so that book was about the blocking and tackling of how to be a really great frontline manager. Leveraged again some of my Marine Corps experience. So then it took me a while. People said, well, what's next after the first one came out? And my answer really was, I don't know. It took a while, bike rides, working out in the gym, talking to other people, continuing to coach. And I think what I discovered after a few years of kind of reflecting on the question in the back of my head is that the transition from, senior director to vice president, or from, line manager to more strategic leader is a really big jump for a lot of us. We tell our vice presidents to be strategic, but I don't think we ever define what that means. There are certainly competency models out there that define, the how-tos of strategic leadership. But what I discovered in talking with dozens and dozens of executives who've made that transition, it's really about thinking in different ways, developing mindsets that we're not tactical anymore. We're global and we're broader. We're leaning into ambiguity. We're more comfortable making courageous and difficult decisions than, laying out the step by step. And so that was the inspiration for the book. And I was pretty pleased with how it turned out.
How long did it take you to write the book?
About a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you provide an overview of the book? Maybe go through some of the chapter names and kind of break down what that path is, that journey is that you take the reader on, Janet?
Yes. Yep. So I was very, very fortunate to work with 3 different executives on the book. So I was inspired from Adam Grant's recent book because he said he always has a reader team or an early reader team that he drafts a chapter and then he gives it to this early reader team for them to give feedback and no, you're way off track here and you're on track there. And I got to use 3 or 4 executives that I have known well and coached over the years. So the first chapter talks about, an overview of the book. What does it cover? Someone told me that a great nonfiction book should really cover the entirety of the book and kind of entice the readers for more. And so then the next several chapters talk about each of these mindsets and how do you shift them. So for example, the second chapter is around thinking strategically and moving from an operational orientation to a more strategic orientation. And I have defined what I believe strategic thinking is, and then some of the ways that you can get your mind into a sense of strategic rather than tactical operational mode. I talk about empowering managers rather than supervising them.
Janet, without giving away the store.
Yeah.
Can you what is your view on strategic thinking? Just an overview.
Yeah.
What do you consider it? What does it look like?
Sure. So strategic thinking is moving beyond the here and now to thinking about over the horizon. What's next for you? What's next for your team? What's next for your organization? And then how do you connect the pieces of the organization to achieve that sense of what might be coming? So it's not only connecting the dots internally, what is operations doing? What is supply chain happening? What's marketing doing? But it's also then being out in your community and in your industry to understand what are the trends, what's happening in your community, how are you giving back, and what really is going to happen to your industry in the next 2 or 3 years and not just in this year.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So other chapters are around listening more than talking. So making sure that leaders aren't at the front of the room, setting all the direction and giving all the specifics, but really setting the intention and then allowing people to interact and provide their perspectives. Having an outward focus, we just talked about that, and acting
Mhm.
courageously. You know, Adam Grant and Malcolm Gladwell both define creative acting with courage as acting with the fear of the unknown, taking the information that you have, leveraging your experience, your gut, and then making decisions that are decisive, that are can be followed up on. They may not be perfect decisions, but if you prolong a decision, the opportunity may leave. And so it's knowing when I need to make decisions and then getting the team to stick with that.
Yeah, it's such a good point just in terms of just the way we overanalyze, overthink, and
Mm.
just paralyze ourselves without, yeah, striking while the iron's hot. I got a bunch
Mhm,
of cliches in there, but I mean, all these
mhm.
cliches come from true experiences. We just have to hear like the right kind of examples and stories behind them to make those cliches come to life. But it's true. It's amazing. Even just in coming up with this podcast, there were years ago where I would think about doing it and I was just kind of paralyzed with how do you do it? How do you do it?
Mhm.
It just comes to the point where you do your due diligence, pull the trigger, get started, and then
Mhm.
refine as you go. I mean,
Yeah.
build that bridge while you cross it, build that
Mhm,
car while you drive it. So there's something to be said about, are we waiting and thinking too much, or are we moving and
mhm.
evolving as we go?
Yeah, they really are. Because all of these things, all these mindsets do impact the brand that you create of your leadership self and how other people see you. We have a chapter about dealing with tough people situations, and what I remind executives, because we do in executive coaching talk a lot about employee situations and issues and what are you dealing with, and as you prolong yourself, you your brand is impacted. People think you're not doing anything about that person who isn't pulling their weight or who comes to work all
Yeah.
the time or does sloppy work. Yeah, there's an impact on the team, but there's impact on you as the leader because people think you're not doing anything about it.
Yeah. That's a good one. In this little scope of conversation we're having where it's about, are you pulling the trigger or not, and are you pulling it soon enough? That's a major one that I see where leaders are paralyzed. They don't wanna make a decision, they wanna put it off, or, they don't want to draw up too much emotion in themselves or in someone else with the decision they need to make, and at the same time, people are frustrated and getting emotional all around, keeping it to themselves, but
Mhm,
people are perceptive. If you're the leader and you're like, okay, there's something wrong with this person, I need to do something here, there's a good chance you're not the only one that sees that. People are perceptive the people the people around them because everything impacts them. They're
mhm,
sensitive, meaning they can pick it up easily. So leaders need to move quickly because others can't perceive what's going on.
mhm.
I think leaders don't give other people enough credit when it comes to that, when it comes to really being perceptive about what's going on in their environment.
Mhm. I think you're absolutely right.
But thank you for that example. That was great.
Yeah. So, what I've also done is I've put together a development program, which is around strategic leadership. So that's been kind of fun as a result of that. But, and I give talks from time to time to different groups about, what does really strategic leadership look like? Because I think it's one of those things we have a hard time putting our finger on. And it's probably one of those, I'll know it when I see it. Yes, she's really
Mm.
being strategic right now, but how is she doing that?
How did you come across that thinking about the meaning of strategy? Was there a particular moment, situation in either your work as a coach where you're like, okay, people aren't understanding what strategic mindset is or strategy is? What was it that happened that kind of got
Mhm.
you focused on that that difference between understanding it and not understanding it?
Well, I think it was several things. I think it was experiences of talking to leaders who are supposed to be more strategic and are much more tactical. I think it was using some of the definitions from various competency tools about what strategic orientation really is. And, let's face it, ChatGPT helped me as well. If you type in what is strategic leadership, you get some good insights. I used ChatGPT as I was writing the book, but I tell people that I think it's a great tool for giving you insights and maybe a starting place. And then you have to use your knowledge and your research to further elaborate and to verify that that indeed is true. So I think the definition of strategic leadership came from a number of sources. I don't think it's mine alone, but when people ask me what it is, that's how I describe it.
Yeah, I was just curious, not that it came from you alone, but just if there were particular moments that stood out, like, wow, the understanding of that word, of that idea would make the difference in this environment.
Mm,
So, okay, I'm sorry. And
yeah.
the rest of the chapters, the rest of that journey.
Let's see. Then there's just a couple more. One is around acting courageously. We talked about that. And then leading into ambiguity, getting comfortable with the uncertain. And I think
Mm,
that we are so faced as leaders right now with so much uncertainty. In the United States, every 4 years, we have a new administration, and that changes things. The world landscape changes things. And so, again, we talked just a minute ago, John, about waiting on decisions and being comfortable with ambiguity, dealing with the information that you have right now here today, rather than the information I wish I had. And if I wait another 3 or 4 days for it to come and reveal itself, again, that opportunity may be missing.
Janet, I mean, the world we're living in right now, the
Mhm,
politics of our country, not to get politics, but the
mhm,
politics of our country is kind of it's wait and see. Um,
mhm,
the president is acting in such a way that is catching the other side off guard.
mhm,
Um, if you could draw a parallel, again, this is not to get political at all. Anybody can see it watching all the newses, the newses of just one side doing something that's catching the other side off guard.
mhm,
And
mhm,
people are saying, listen, they have to think of new ways. You can't retaliate or you can't
mhm,
rebut in the traditional manners because it just doesn't take. So they're saying, the other side is not doing anything. They're not doing enough. They're not
mhm,
doing anything quick enough.
mhm.
Aside from politics, um, have you seen that kind of parallel in some of your clients? Not naming names, but
Mhm.
in general, what does it look like when something is evolving so quickly? What does it look like when the right leader does what they need to do? Aside from having all the answers, what is it? What are some of the steps that they should take when something
Yeah,
is coming at them that's not traditional, that's
yeah.
unorthodox, that isn't expected?
I think leaders have been facing that for years. If you think about supply chain, for example, during COVID, got
Mm,
all messed up, and some of the changes that leaders were able to make were good ones. Some of them were not so good ones. There's a carrier ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal, and it stops lots of ship traffic for months.
I
And
forgot
so I
about that.
think, yeah, right. We forget about these because
God.
we've adapted and carried on. So it's not just the national politics that kind of keeps us off kilter. And so I think um, I had a business partner for years who focused on innovation and creativity. And the line that she taught me that I will carry for the rest of my life is, how do I think about this differently? And I think whether you're talking about our national climate right now or a supply chain issue, we get stuck in, here's how I've always thought about this. This is not good for that group or this group, or people are going to react this way. And yet, if you put a hat on that says, how am I going to think about this differently? And then ask your team that question. We know how we're thinking about it now. How can we think about this differently? What's the opportunity that this creates? What's really the goodness that this is creating? What's the worst that can happen? as humans, we tend to go down that rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, everything's going to fall apart because this isn't how we've always done it. And yet, sometimes it does create breakthrough thinking. As a leader, though, we have to have that patience to bring our teams together to allow them to have the breakthrough thinking. Because what we absolutely know about human behavior and the way the mind works is most of us can't switch automatically from tactical thinking to strategic thinking, from operational orientation to way big creativity and innovation. The mind is just not able to switch that fast. And so as a leader in these very difficult times, taking time to pause, bring the team together and say, all right, how haven't we thought about this? What haven't we tried? What are some of the outlandish ideas that we could give some voice to and see what the goodness is there?
Great. Thank you. Any other chapters you wanted to provide an overview for? I don't know where we were in the book.
I think that's probably it. I don't want to give everything away because I do
Oh, no,
want
of course.
people to take a look. The other thing that I'm really pleased about the book is it has several assessments built in. There's some checklists that describe, again, listening more than talking. Are you doing these 6 kind of things, or are they sometimes, rarely, or always? And so there's a way to, the way the book was written, it's a couple hour read on a airplane ride, an opportunity to make a lot of notes and dog ear some places. And so it's not intended to read from cover to cover, but as a tips and tricks and mind jogger, if you will, to spend some time on. I'm not really spending enough time listening. How can I get better at that?
Yeah, I think as busy as people are, I think they can appreciate something that they can jump in and kind of look specifically for where they're at in any given moment or situation. So I can appreciate that. Janet, when it comes to you and this book, I'm curious, how did you evolve based on putting out this book? How did your thinking change in writing it? At all, in any area of the process of this book? From when you started thinking about writing something to when you published it to after talking to people who have read it, how has this changed you and the way that you looked at the subject matter?
Yeah. Well, I think I discovered yet again, and when I've done big volumes, that I think there's a writer in all of us. I think you have to just start, and you don't start by writing a 150-page book. You start by a few paragraphs. Maybe you get into blogging. John, you're certainly doing some writing. LinkedIn is a great opportunity to share your thoughts in a couple of paragraphs. And so I think starting one piece at a time, I had a chance to just complete a neuroscience program. And one of the biggest ways to overcome our procrastination is to do the very first step, or just one small step. So it's writing a paragraph. I finished my dissertation in a calendar year, and that was the commitment I made to my young family. And I did that by literally writing a paragraph at a time, saying, okay, every week I have to spend some time on it. Let me get a page done, and then I'll stop. And I think for anybody, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, to just get started, have a bit of a layout, an outline, and then see where it goes. And know that anytime you write, you're probably going to throw half of it away. It doesn't make sense, or it just doesn't follow your thinking. And that's okay. It's just part of the writing process.
Yeah, I'm a master procrastinator. So bad. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that when I finally get around to my list, for each thing that I have on my list, as soon as I start it, it's not as long as I thought it was going to take. It's not as stressful as I thought it was going to be. It's not as time consuming, energy consuming. That's the worst part about procrastination, is once you do get started, it's not as bad as you feared. Again, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Once you get through that, the process is, and I've rarely come across something where it's like I started it and I'm like, no, and give up, like most of these things that are on your to-do list, you start them and you get through them so quickly. And that's one of those pieces of advice. Just get started. I hear all the time, again, sounds cliche, but I would echo your sentiment where it's like just chip away at it little by little
Mhm. Yeah.
until you gain that momentum to carry you forward.
Mhm. Mhm.
Happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, setting some sort of realistic deadline, this is my third tome. I guess my first one was certainly my dissertation. And I set myself some realistic guidelines. I don't know if a year for other people to write a book is a reasonable amount or not. People have taken 5, 8, 10. You've talked to those people, years to write a book. And I think putting some sort of guideline around. And so when you start writing a book, to say, okay, here's the general layout. And now how far am I going to be by summertime? How far am I going to be by September? What do I need to have done? And on this second book, I did actually create a grid that said, okay, here's it. The first readers have read it. The second readers have read it. I need to have this stuff done by then. And that did help me just keep moving along. Because like you said, if I was stuck on a chapter and I procrastinated, say, on leading into ambiguity, there were certainly other chapters to do. And so
Yeah.
being able to move around helped get me unstuck as well.
Generally, so in summary of the book, what do you hope people take away? What's a major lesson or a major viewpoint you want somebody to take away from this book, from your
Yeah.
book?
I think fundamentally that they don't have to master all of these mindsets. You start with one. And I think leadership is just like that. If we laid up side to side 4 different leaders, we would say they excel at different things, and yet they're all still effective. And so for yourself, use one of the assessments in the book and say, wow, how talented am I at this? How much passion do I have to further leverage this skill? And start with 1 or 2. Don't start with the whole laundry list.
And obviously, I know how much time it takes to write a book. I know these are recent books that you've written. I'm not putting any pressure on you, but where do you think you might want to go next with your writing in
Ah,
general?
yeah. Well, I'm enjoying sharing the content right now. There's a lot of content that I developed, and I think that it's very effective. So I'm starting to talk about each of the mindsets on LinkedIn, for example, and in my blog posts. I think, though, the next book will reveal itself when it's time. I'm not ready to take that on because it is very time consuming.
I can imagine.
Um,
I can imagine.
and and you do that essentially on top of everything else we do, the coaching and the team development and so forth. And so I'm enjoying the content that I developed. I had a really, really good editor that helped me make the words really sing. And I was really pleased with the way the book looked visually. So I think that when we accomplish something big, make sure we leverage that accomplishment rather than thinking about, well, what's next? Well, what's next is to sharing with the world the insights that I discovered from my research.
Hmm. And it really wasn't pressure at all. Really wasn't pressure.
Yeah. No, I didn't
Um,
feel it.
okay, good. Obviously, this is your book, so we're talking about your book in this episode. What's a book that has inspired you in your work, in your life, your leadership? Is there a book that stands out to you?
Yeah. Well, there's 2 actually. And I've discovered, and I've been kind of collaborating with my daughter about this, that we like to listen to nonfiction books on tape. They just seem to resonate more. I just finished listening to The Revenge of the Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, and he actually reads this book. And
Yeah.
so it's just, he talks to the listener rather than kind of reading the book. And so it's filled with some amazing examples about what he further defines the tipping point, and it's someplace between the 25 and 35% adoption. And then he shares some real world examples of communities and just in property ownership and so forth, that you can really understand fully what that tipping point concept is all about.
Yeah, actually, I've never listened to audiobooks. His was that book was the first one I've listened to. I haven't finished it, but and he's got
Mhm,
that unique voice
mhm.
to him. So it's interesting that you mentioned that book.
Yeah.
Did you mention the second book?
The other one is very similar. It's Adam Grant's uh, Hidden Potential. And again, I listened to it on tape, and he does kind of the same thing. He narrates more than reads. And
Mm,
then, because it's a well produced audiobook. And so there's some real life examples that are voiced in different voices. And so it's a very enjoyable, entertaining listen in addition to the content.
yeah, both great writers, both great research they include in stories and analogies, and both unique voices. Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah.
Janet, and wrapping up, what are you up to these days? Is there anything that you want to share with this audience? Anything at all? The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, John. I have just started a new offering that I'm very excited about. It's called Just in Time Coaching. You and I both do coaching as a living, and we sell kind of a package. It lasts several months. There's assessments, we meet with the boss and so forth. And those are
Mhm.
generally supported by the corporation. What I'm finding in all of this turmoil between layoffs and shrinking budgets, that some individuals need the benefit of coaching but can't necessarily get that financial support from their organization. So what I'm doing is just in time coaching, an hour at a time. You can find a link to it on my LinkedIn site at Janet Polach. And, it's one meeting, it's several meetings. It's really helping taking the coaching technology, which is I'm kind of stuck on something. How can I talk to somebody else who's not my significant other about this issue and get some better insight, kind of
Yeah.
get unstuck and start to move forward? So I'm really excited about that. You can do 1 hour, you can do several hours. It's just, it's a new way of offering coaching, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it helps get it to the masses. It helps a lot of people. It makes it affordable, but you're still providing that quality of your packages. So
Mhm.
I appreciate that, that you sharing that program. Um, and again, the book we covered is Janet's own book, The Strategic Leader's Mindset, Unlocking the Keys to Success. Janet, thank you so much for sitting down with me for this conversation.
It was a total delight. Thanks, John.
And if there's anything I might have missed, there's so much to cover, limited time, or something you're curious about that I should have asked Janet about, please let me know. Send me an email. I'll reach out to Janet, and see what kind of insights that I can get back, what else she might be able to share. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.